Obviously, normally you wouldn't think of League and old Greek guys as even vaguely related, but I think the phrase getting good bridges the gap very well because, in League people often say to get good, and at least for people who play competitively, the focus is on getting good. And the Greek philosophers had the same goal of getting good. They wanted to know what is the good life. Now, you might object that I'm taking the phrase out of context, and it actually has two different meanings that aren't really related. It could be that they were concerned with a good totally separate from good League of Legends, both in terms of what it is and how to obtain it. But I think there's a pretty good case that even though League came along however many thousand years later and seems completely different, the philosophers are still very applicable to it. So to see if League could be related to the good, we have to ask what the good is. But that's not a trivial question, right? In a way, it's a central question, and everything else is just filling in the details. And it's complicated by the fact that they don't give the same answer, and further complicated by the fact that Plato's idea of the good is sort of weird and doesn't make sense, or at least is hard to make sense of. So let's put Plato to the side for now and get to him later, since Aristotle gives an account of the good life that's much easier to apply, so we can use that as a starting point. Aristotle uses some criteria to argue the best life is one of contemplation, but I think they apply very well to League. First of all, we need the concept of instrumental versus intrinsic value. Something with intrinsic value is valuable for its own sake, whereas something with instrumental value is valuable for the sake of something else. For example, money has instrumental value because it's not an end in and of itself, but it can be used to obtain other things we consider valuable. Or if for some reason you had to go somewhere, if you drove there not because you enjoy driving, but because you just needed to get there, driving would have instrumental value, whereas if you bike somewhere just because you enjoy biking, there would be intrinsic value in that. And if there is some highest good, then this chief good must have intrinsic value, because if you think about things with instrumental value, they're for the sake of something else, and even if you have a chain of however many actions with instrumental value, then the train has to end somewhere, and that final action with intrinsic value is the final good. And I think League meets this criteria because we clearly don't play it for the sake of anything else. Like, if you just think about all the hours you spend on it, they aren't productive in the sense of instrumental value, as they don't do anything for your life outside League. Obviously, there are some streamers and pro players who might not actually like playing, just do it as a job. Most people don't get anything external from League, they just do it for its own sake. But Aristotle notes that relaxing seems to be similar in that it isn't for the sake of anything else, which is a problem since relaxing isn't the final good, but now it appears sort of it could be. So, like, League could just be a valueless amusement, so even though it isn't for the sake of anything else, it also doesn't have intrinsic value. So, he resolves that by saying we relax so that we can rejuvenate ourselves at work, so really it's for the sake of something else. And so it isn't the good activity, and the good activity will require exertion. So the critical matter that League being a good activity or amusement seems to rest on is if it requires exertion or not. And this differs from person to person, but I think solo queue, ranked, is a serious competitive mode of play that takes exertion, or at least in general it can be, although obviously some games are pretty troll. Um, and finally, maybe the biggest reason is Aristotle equates virtue with happiness to the point where I think even if you were out curing cancer and saving puppies or whatever, if you weren't happy doing it, then it wouldn't be a truly virtuous activity. And I think League is a game that makes you happy, or at least I'd hope that is. It's sort of the whole point. And I mean, obviously, similar to real sports, it's going to be a love-hate relationship. It's not going to make you happy in a sort of blissful, completely happy all the time way, but eventually it will at least be hopefully happy in a satisfying way. So hopefully this is a good account of why League could be a virtuous activity for Aristotle, because I think there is a good case for it. Now for Plato, so like I said before, it's hard to know exactly what Plato considers virtuous, and the challenge here is the forms, because honestly Plato's forms are just confusing, so I will get to the forms later when discussing Plato and getting good, but for now, just to show League could be a virtuous activity for Plato, I'm going to use justice instead, which is a much more concrete good, which I guess just goes to show how abstract and weird the forms are when justice, which you would normally consider a fairly abstract concept itself, seems much easier to define and exemplify. Plato gives an account of justice using a city to soul analogy, but I think it could be generalized and defined as an internal harmony of virtues which can be applied to league. So the particular virtues he gives are courage, wisdom, and moderation, and justice is each of them doing their own job and not interfering with the others, basically minding their own business. He considers virtue to be the same in cities and souls, just like bigger in the former. And the only difference is scale. The virtues are the same, which is one thing we have to maybe contradict to apply his definition of justice, is like what exactly the virtues are. Because I suppose you could try to apply courage, wisdom, and moderation to league, but I think it works much nicer if you let the virtues be individual roles. So that way, justice in league is the five players doing their roles to win the game and not interfering with each other, which fits with the idea of justice as an internal like harmony of parts for the sake of the whole very well, I think. So in a team with justice, everybody has their own job they want to do. Like the AD carry wants to farm, or the jungler wants to invade, or whatever. And the individual roles can have multiple jobs. But the point is, they play their roles for the sake of the team winning, so they can't interfere with each other. And so, like, if the AD carry wants to go farm away bot, but the team needs him at Baron, then it would be unjust for him to go bot because it would stop the other roles in the team from doing their job of controlling Baron. This might not be as good of a case for League as a good activity for Plato as there was one for Aristotle, but I think you could at least claim that Plato has an idea of justice that he considers a good thing, which you could apply to the five players on the League team. So far, this has all been summary of why League could be a good and virtuous activity for Plato and Aristotle, but now we can move into a discussion of actually getting good. And I think it's been implied all along that that's the point. All the League as a virtuous activity claims were based on wanting to win. So now it's about their accounts of getting good, and this is the interesting part since we can compare them. So now the question is really about method. Like, we're assuming that being good at League is good and asking how do you get good. And in general, I like Aristotle's answer a lot more in practice because it sounds pretty reasonable. His method is to observe people we consider good and emulate them. And outside of League, there might actually be a problem with this. You want to become virtuous by copying instances of virtue in other people, but if that's the case, how do you originally know who to copy? Because it seems like unless you already know what virtue is, you won't know who's actually virtuous. You might end up trying to learn from someone who isn't particularly good, or even worse, you might actually pick up bad habits from bad people. Crazy notion to just learn from how other people do it, which I think is good. It's good that it sounds realistic and almost obvious. The thing is, Aristotle came after Plato, whose view is radically different. He didn't care about what most people thought or did. For Plato, if something was good, it could be good even though everyone does the opposite. For example, if they're designing cities and how people should live and be governed in them, Aristotle will look at existing cities and take elements from them that he considers good, or at least use how people live in practice as a basis for some of his ideas. But Plato doesn't care about how people actually are. He's only going to look at existing cities to say, wait, this is wrong, and this is wrong, and that is wrong, and this is also wrong. This difference comes up in League too. If Aristotle was figuring out how to play, he would care about what's meta and follow what most players do and what high elo players do, whereas Plato would have complete faith in his own ability to reason out what good play is. He wouldn't care about what anyone else says or does, even if they have a challenger flare. So Aristotle's the type of guy to look at flares when he's browsing Summoner School because he wants to see who's good and learn from them, whereas Plato isn't going to copy anyone, so he's not going to use flares. To fully expand on this, we need to deal with the forms. So for Plato, the things that we would consider real are sort of secondary to the form. So for example, if you see a chair, it's really only a shadow of the form of a chair, which is the perfect idea of a chair. Or what's truly good is the form of the good. And if you don't know what that is, neither do I. That's why we use justice instead of goodness earlier. But for Plato, these forms exist, so good League of Legends play would follow the form of good play. You might be wondering how anyone is supposed to reach the forms. You certainly can't by looking at real life, because real life isn't perfect and only resembles the forms. Instead, for Plato, maybe a philosopher could use reason to deduce them from his own soul. At this point, you're probably like, not only is this boring and doesn't make sense, it's dumb that the forms are the only true knowledge but seem like unattainable, which is good. That's what I want you to think because I want to show they're the wrong way of thinking about good league play. Because as ridiculous as this sounds, lots of people actually do think about good league play this way. People have this idea of perfect play that they compare everything to, which naturally makes everything seem bad. In this way of thinking, the best play you've ever seen is really only a shadow of the true form of good play. Since this only the form of perfect play is really good play, and nothing else lives up to it, nothing else is good. And if you don't believe me that people think like this, just look at the comments on any league game or play on Reddit. It could literally be like the world's finals between the two best teams in the world, and there will still be tons of comments saying how this was bad, and this was bad, and that was bad. And I don't like this view, but I'll try and be as charitable as I can before I object to it. So maybe you could argue that it's just true that there's just like perfect league play, which is the only real good play, and maybe this isn't even a bad thing or a bad mentality to have because you can try and get your own play as close to good play as possible. So to do that, you need to be aware of how you're bad. You can't get good without understanding how you're bad, so you have to consider yourself bad. Everything other than perfect play being bad implies that everyone is trash at the game. Again, I'm trying to be charitable here, so I'll try and explain why this could be good view to have. So when you see people saying gold is trash, diamond 5 is trash, master 0 LP is trash, or whatever rank is trash, basically what they're doing is they want to call everyone trash, but they're too like bashful to call people way better than them bad. But like the people who are honest with this view just come out and say everyone is bad. And they defend themselves by saying, I'm not just calling you bad, I'm calling myself bad too. So it's not just a personal attack, it's just that to improve, you need to consider yourself bad. I really don't like this view. I don't think that the perfect, ideal form of good play is the right way to think about good play. So, first, I want to respond to the idea that you need to consider yourself terrible in order to improve because it's maybe the most insidious move since there's a grain of truth in it. It's true that you need to recognize your mistakes in order to fix them, so that part of it is true. To get good, you need to know what you do wrong, but I don't think it follows that you need to compare yourself to perfect play and necessarily consider yourself bad to do that. If you think about it as a spectrum with good play on one end and bad on the other, you're somewhere in the middle and want to move towards the good. But you don't have to get perfectly good to improve. And what's more, I think it's pointless to think only in terms of perfect play as good and everything else is bad. Because people do that and say stuff like gold and silver are both shit and there's no difference between them because they're just both bad. But I think that's just wrong. The fact that neither is close to perfect play doesn't make them the same in every way. And it's a mistake to trivialize the difference between them. I'd argue that if you're a silver player who wants to get gold, then your standard of good play should be a gold level of play. You don't need to measure up to the form of perfect play to get gold. So, for the vast majority of players, comparing yourself to the form of true good play is pointless. I think people only do it because they like being critical and calling people trash. Like, that's not to say it's bad to be critical, but I think you can divide criticisms into two types. The first type is just an objective statement of fact about your play, like in this situation, you should have flashed the blitz hook. The second is a subjective opinion, like if you don't flash blitz's hook there, you're bad. I don't think anyone has a problem with the former, but I don't think you need the latter. You can have the objective criticism without the opinion of whether it's good or bad, so the only reason you would bother to call it bad is if you enjoy calling yourself and others bad. Because going back to the spectrum of play from bad to good, remember that for the overwhelming majority of players, you're not even close to perfectly good play. So you don't need to compare yourself to it. So just for example, right, I play with a lot of 80 carries in solo queue, and I think some of them are pretty good. But right now, out of all the 80 carries I play with, I don't think it would make sense for anybody except maybe like Double F to compare himself to the perfect form of play. And I'm not saying he's like the only good ADC. I'm saying I think Cody's son's good, Johnson's good, Aries pretty good, Sneaky's decent, and so on and so forth. There are plenty of AD carries who I'd be happy to play with, but even for those players, there's still plenty of room to improve without reaching perfection. Overall, I don't think you need to compare yourself to the form of perfect play, and if you do that, then you get a pretty depressing conclusion, which is that you'll never be good. And I know that in general it's wrong to reject an argument based on its conclusion, but it seems like it's arbitrary what standard you use to compare yourself with. So, like, what you want to call good play is subjective, so you might as well make it something attainable. So, one definition of good play that I personally like is that, and that definitely is not the completely perfect form, is just that good play is better than you played yesterday. And one other point about Plato that I'd like to come back to is you don't necessarily have knowledge of the forms. Remember that even for Plato, most people don't and probably can't even attain them. So, probably in the same way that Plato would say a vulgar craftsman wouldn't have access to the forms, even though they're the best thing, he would say the average league player doesn't, and what they do to get good is always sort of second best, which I just don't like. Just to say one nice thing about Plato, I think his notion of justice maps well into a league team, especially the fact that it's an internal harmony and doesn't depend on anything external, which I like because I think too often people judge players and teams based on their results, and by doing that, you're not judging just them. You're letting an external factor into your judgment that should only be based on the player or team. So I like how a team working together has the virtue of justice by definition, regardless of whether they win or lose. And that was a lot about Plato, but hopefully I got across that I don't like applying his idea of the form of the good to league. So now it's hardly an original idea that Aristotle makes more sense in practice, but that's what I'm going to argue. Remember, for Aristotle, we can learn about what's good from seeing it in the world. I think this maps very well into League because nobody just goes onto the LoL wiki and reads what their abilities do and figures out how to play their champion just from that. You need to actually play and watch other people play and watch yourself play. And I'd even say Aristotle's view maps really well into League because ranked matchmaking isn't that bad. And this isn't true for every game, but at least fairly often, there's someone on the other team who is good enough to expose a mistake you made. I mean, some games are just complete stomps, but most of the time you can say, huh, that guy did something good there. I should try to do that or prepare for it. Because it's really easy to know who is good because they beat you or they're higher elo. Obviously, there are some exceptions, like maybe their team beat yours, but they didn't actually do anything to win their team the game, or maybe they're a higher elo than you, but aren't actually good on the specific champions you want to play. But as a general rule, you can tell who's good, so it's easy to learn what's good. A criticism of this might be that there's no room for anything new. If people are just copying other people all the time, then where does good play originally come from? But I think that can be explained with people just trying random stuff and seeing how it goes and reasoning a bit about what works and what doesn't. So there is a little room for innovation. But if you think about League as a whole, very little of the good stuff people do is actually their own idea. Almost all the time it's just learned from what other people do, which is what we call the meta. And occasionally something does come along that's new and good because people are trying random stuff that they think might be good, and once in a while it actually is good. But even if you take something like support MF to counter Zyra or Fervor Leona to kill Lulu, which you would think is the height of innovation, even then it's still mainly people learning from what others do. Like what happens if someone tries something in solo queue, other people try it, a pro sees it, it thinks it might be troll, but it's worth trying because it could be good, tries it in scrims, and if it turns out to be good, that's how Fervor Leona becomes meta. And in that process, most of it was just people learning from other people to see if it was actually good or just trolling. It's not like Ignar just like closed his eyes and meditated, and by thinking about the true nature of bot lane, somehow created the knowledge that he could kill Leona or Lulu with Fervor Leona. It might help to talk more about what the nature of good play actually is and not just how people come to acquire it, because I think this will seem a lot more correct when you accept the role of habit. Not even considering League for a moment, just thinking about people's characters in general, you go through a huge number of decisions every day without even thinking about them, and you perform better than a baby would. So clearly there's something at work other than just your nature. And it might just be a reason, but you don't reason everything out every time you open a door or use a fork and knife. So what you're using is habits. You've become accustomed to acting certain ways and just naturally follow your habits. So now going back to League, the idea of habits makes a lot of sense, and I think even shows why people who talk about autopilot as if it's something terrible or wrong. There's simply too much going on in League to reason everything out as you do it. Instead, you have to rely on habits to do most things in the game. So, really, you get good by developing good habits. The idea of eliminating habit altogether is just sort of silly and not humanly possible. I think instead, to get better, you have to make your habits better. So, for example, in the same way that someone who's developed good habits in soccer will be able to shoot without thinking consciously about it and just know if the ball is going to go in or not from the moment they've kicked it, someone who's gotten good at karma will naturally take good opportunities to hit Q and know if it's going to hit as soon as they go to throw it out. I know people often explain how to play using reason as if reason is how we understand how to play, but I think it really is just habit. Often I think people are just wrong when they do this and don't completely understand the game because there's just so much going on, so they try to reason things out but really can't. I think at best, reason is a tool to help people adopt good habits. And I'd even go so far as to call the meta our collective habits, and people's attempts to explain it just largely BS because there's no way they actually understand everything that goes into it, so it's necessarily just guessing at a rationalization for why things are the way they are. The final point for Aristotle I'd like to address is the idea of a mean. This isn't necessarily a true mean in the sense of an average, like the mean of 1 and 7 is 4. It's just the notion that you can have a quality in excess or deficiency, and the correct amount is somewhere in between those two extremes. So not too much, not too little. And I think this can be applied really well to League because maybe the most important thing for a really good player is the ability to push their limits to the very extreme without going too far. So, like, there's always a balance you want to strike so that you make all the plays you can make, but don't try any you can't. Or, in other words, go as aggressive as you can without going over aggressive. So one really sexy description is playing on a knife's edge, which I think really gets across the idea that you're pushing your play to the absolute limit and doing as much as you can, and if you mess up once, you're screwed. So what makes a really good player is the ability to play in that proper mean where they go as aggressive as possible without going over aggressive. That's about it. I might have missed something, or I might just be wrong, but hopefully this was at least a good attempt. I guess if there's one sentence to take away, it's that Aristotle's constitution of the good is more realistic and maps better onto League in practice. I do want to take a last moment to defend Plato, though, because I think I may have been unfair to him in the very premise of this argument, which is that it makes sense for a League of Legends player to care about what constitutes the good as a means of getting better. Plato would definitely object to the idea that the forms don't have value because you can't apply them to something, and say that they're just the true nature of things, and the form of good league play just exists, and my failure to apply it doesn't change anything.